Hello, in this video, I'm going to tell you about descriptive statistics. So what are descriptive statistics? They are statistics that summarize the features of a data set. So they're statistics that are telling us all about the data. So not necessarily about conclusions we could draw or anything that we're learning from the data necessarily, but they're statistics that describe the data itself. So like what type of participants were involved? So how many male versus female, or all of those sorts of things. So they summarize the features of the data set. So we have three categories of descriptive statistics. So measures of frequency, measures of central tendency, and measures of variability or dispersion. So I'm going to talk about each of those briefly. So measures of frequency are certainly the simplest, most easy to calculate and to understand and interpret. It is a simple count of the number of times something happened. So we can express it as just a simple count or as a percentage. So for example, if we have a study with 100 participants and 50 were male, 50 were female, then that is a measure of frequency. We're saying that there were 50 males that happened this many times, and there were 50 females that happened this many times. So that's a measure of frequency. That same statistic can also be reported as a percentage. So we could also say 50% male and 50% female. So that applies to all sorts of things about our data. We can do all sorts of counts and percentages. So we could look at all sorts of demographics about our population, like do some participants have an undergraduate degree and others do not? Or some had a good result from the exposure in the experiment and others had no effect. So those are measures of frequency. So just how many times did this thing occur? All right, so next are measures of central tendency. Those are statistics that tell us about the middle of a distribution. So what we mean here is mean, median, and mode. So here I'm just kind of introducing them briefly. I also made a separate video where I go into a lot more detail and talk about the advantages and disadvantages of using each. So if you're interested, that video is linked in the description below. So your mean is simply the average. It's just a fancy word for the average of scores, or the average of the values that we're finding our central point. Median is if we are looking for the centermost score. So if you take all of the scores and put them in order from greatest to least or vice versa, and you find the value that is right in the center, that is the median. And then finally, the mode is whatever value was most frequently occurring in the data. So maybe you collected 100 data points on a specific variable, and one of them, or one potential value happened again and again and again, happened a lot of times. So that would be your mode, the most frequently occurring data point or score. All right, so finally, measures of variability or dispersion. These are statistics that tell us how spread out the data points are. So how spread out are they compared to the mean? So we can only use measures of variability for data for which we can calculate a mean. So we can't use measures of variability for nominal or ordinal data because we can't calculate the average. So this is really just about comparing the individual data points to the average and seeing how far do those data points tend to be from the average of all of the data. So there's a lot to say again here. So I recorded a separate video on this topic. It is also linked in the description. So check it out if you want to see more about advantages and disadvantages of each of these measures of variability. So range is the span of the scores in the distribution. So very simple to calculate. It is simply the highest score minus the lowest score, and you've got your range of scores in the distribution. Deviation refers to how far off a data point is from the average. So it's the distance between one value in the data set and the average. So if that value in the data set is below the average, then the deviation of that data point is negative. If the value is above the average, then the value of that data point, or that value is going to be considered, the deviation of that value would be considered positive because it's above the average. So if we calculate the deviations of all the data points and add them together, they'll equal 0 because the average is right in the center. So that means that half of the data are going to be negative and half are going to be positive. And when we add them all together, they'll equal 0 because the average is showing the exact midpoint of the data. So the mean deviation is the average amount of deviation. But think about what I just said, that if we add all the deviations together, they'll equal 0. So we have to solve that problem because we can't find the average deviation using 0. So what we do instead is for mean deviation, we use the absolute values of all the deviations, and we use those to calculate the average amount of deviation. So what that means is all of the negative deviations we treat as positive instead and calculate the mean deviation. Now, variance of distribution is simply a different way to handle the same problem. If we want to find the average amount of deviation, we can't do that using the negatives and positives because they'll equal 0. So another way to solve that problem is instead of using absolute values, if we square all of the deviations, the results will all be positive because if you square a negative number, the answer is positive. So for variance of distribution, the difference is that we square all the deviations to make them all positive, add them all together and find the average that way. Then finally, standard deviation is if we take the square root of the variance, right? So to find the variance, we squared all the deviations. So now if we take the square root, we can bring that number back down to reality. So the variance is going to be a really inflated, much higher number that's not really going to make sense in relation to the actual values that you collected. So when we take the standard deviation, it's like we're transforming that squared number that doesn't make any sense with your data. You're bringing that back down to reality so that it's similar to the values that you're actually comparing it against. So that's why standard deviation is the most commonly used measure of variability, because it makes the most sense. It's the easiest to interpret and understand and apply. All right, well, thank you so much for watching this video, and I hope you have a great day. Bye-bye.